Started. So welcome to this masterclass on Space and Earth Interactions 2021, which is part of the UT Austin, Portugal program. And the topic today is the Azores region and deep sea research in the UN decade. And I just wanted to give a very brief context of why we're here today and why we're choosing this topic. Just earlier this year, we've began the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And within the decade, we're looking for transformative ocean science solutions for sustainable development, connecting people and our ocean. And this is a very fitting topic for Portugal, in particular for the Azores, because the Azores arguably can be considered as a unique gateway to deep sea research in support for the UN decade. And there's a number of organizations that are relevant here. One is the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy, which is an international community-based group that coordinates deep observing to understand the state of the global deep ocean with respect to baseline condition, its response to climate change and to human disturbances. This effort, DOOS, is a GOOSE project, so a global ocean observing system, and envisions a globally integrated network of systems that observes the deep ocean in support of ocean science policy and planning. DOOS has also been endorsed by a formally endorsed UN Decade program. So that's very exciting to us. And in particular, in the US, UT Austin actually leads a National Science Foundation AxelNet project that we call IDOOS, which stands for Implementing a Deep Ocean Observing Strategy. This slide just shows a number of organizations nationally and internationally that are involved in the IDOOS program. And for today's session, we're really excited to have some very high-profile speakers and a very varied session that touches upon a variety of aspects of that relates to deep ocean science and for sustainable development. We have, and I'll introduce them in more detail later, but we'll start with Dr. Felix Janssen from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany, Dr. Colaço from IMAR and the University of Azores, Dr. Andrew Thurber from Oregon State University, Dr. Howe from University of Hawaii in Mãnoa, and Dr. Laura Wallace from Institute for Geophysics at UT Austin, and also GNS Science in New Zealand. And you see from their titles that we're really aiming to touch upon a very broad range of topics related to deep ocean science. So with that, I will introduce our first speakers. And in fact, we have a shared presentation by Dr. Felix Janssen and Dr. Colaço. And here we are, so let me very briefly introduce these two speakers. So Felix Janssen is a senior scientist at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. He is a biological oceanographer by training and mostly interested in deep ocean biogeochemistry. We are focused on benthic respiration. He received his PhD in 1995 in biogeochemistry of sandy seafloor ecosystems at the Max Planck Institute in Bremen, where he then also stayed as a postdoc. He then moved on to the AVI in Bremerhaven to do deep sea ecology and technology and joining that group there. Felix has a strong interest in advancing technologies for autonomous in situ measurements at the seafloor. And since the last few years, his work also has been focusing on assessing environmental impacts of deep sea mining in several projects within our European consortia. Fieldwork in these projects mainly targets respiration and microbial ecosystem functions in manganese nodule ecosystems. And part of Felix's work also is dedicated to strengthening open and deep ocean observations. He's co-chair of a national strategy group on open ocean observations and the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy, where he also leads the biochemistry task team. Colaço is a senior researcher at the Institute for Marine Research in the University of Azores. She's a deep sea ecologist specializing in hydrothermal vent ecosystem, trophic eco and deep sea systems, benthic ecology, biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, and conservation. Focus of her research has been the trophic ecology, ecosystem functions of deep sea habitats, especially hydrothermal vents and seamounts. She's engaged in the promotion and installation of observatories in the deep sea floor for the study of marine environment, and her ultimate interest is in conservation, which more precisely is the sustainable use of deep sea environments. Anna also seeks to understand the functioning role of the sponges and the export of organic matter from vents from the surface. And with that, we are just really 5 minutes late, and so please feel free to go through to 35 past the hour, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you for your kind words, and I'm going to start this shared presentation with Felix. I will share my screen. Okay. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Me and my dear colleague Felix Janssen, we are going to talk about the scientific needs for observations and technologies to close the gaps in the Azores region. And we are going to present some biogeochemical oceanography in the Azores region and the work that we have been doing here. So this presentation will introduce the idea of an Azores deep ocean demonstration project that will provide a case study for the region to illustrate opportunities, needs of deep ocean observing, and gives an overview of the existing technologies for biogeochemical observations. And why the deep sea? Well, far from sight, far from heart, it's not true here in the Azores. And actually the deep sea, it's one of the largest environments in the world. If you think 70% of the Earth is ocean, 90% of that ocean is deep sea, and deep sea is everything. It's not just the sea floor, but also the water column. And it's under threat because we are going deeper and deeper to fish, to extract oil and gas. Also, the deep sea is the ultimate sink for pollution, plastics, and other sinking pollutants. There is a new coming industry still in the phase of exploration, which is the deep sea mining. And all the energy that arrives to the sea floor, it's decreasing in certain areas and increasing in other ones. And that's it's because of the climate change, which is affecting all the planet and also the deep sea. We can observe already warming of the deep water masses, acidification, and in several areas, a strong deoxygenation. And the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy is a project from the Global Ocean Observing System and is also a UN Decade endorsed program. Those aims to help closing the gaps in deep ocean observation as needed for a sustaining deep ocean health. And one of those tools is trying to implement these deep ocean observing called demonstration projects. Those demonstration projects should be feasible and show benefits of a multidisciplinary deep ocean observation. So it's not just about one discipline. It should be tailored to regional needs, but it also should be scalable to a larger global scale observation and shall address the essential ocean variables described at GOOS and, if needed, extend behind those, and shall use the state-of-the-art technology and, if need, to advance that state-of-the-art. The selection of the different demonstration projects is based on societal and scientific needs for deep ocean observations and also depends on already existing observing capacities and activities in the areas. There are 3 potential sites: the Azores, here in the Atlantic Ocean, at the Northeast Pacific, in the coast of Canada, where there is already the Ocean Observatory, and in Clarion-Clipperton Fracture Zone, which is an area that is being explored towards deep sea mining. And to move forward this project, there was a set up cooperation between the All Atlantic Ocean Observing System, which is a GOOS-related activity, and GOOS-DOOS. The Atlantis aims to implement a component thematic of observing use cases that are identified to foster ocean observations similar to the DOOS approach. So to develop a case study with a joint Atlantis dose and demonstration project seems to be a very good way to move forward. So there was a scoping workshop in June in the Azores. It was an Atlantis dose workshop. And this first workshop, the participants agreed to focus on the biodiversity of deep sea benthic communities. But at the same time, behind mapping those communities, the project shall also include the water column and seafloor observations to understand how present and future conditions will shape the communities and the environment. So in the following slides, we are going to show you a case study that we have in the Azores, and it's based on ongoing PhD from Claudia Viegas and also from a just finished project, European project, the Sponges project that dealt with deep sea sponge aggregations. So when we seek in the Azores, I don't know if you know where the Azores are, it's here. I hope you can see my mouse. We are mostly in the middle of the North Atlantic, halfway between Lisbon and the east coast of the United States, and above the mid-Atlantic ridge. And the Azores is influenced by several water masses. And if we think on the surface circulation, we have here the Gulf Stream that will divide in the North Atlantic current and the Azores current. And these boundaries can change with the years and with the seasons. And then we have the North Atlantic subtropical gyre. But when we go and see the water masses, we can see that in the Azores region, we have several water masses, and the ones that are most different, it's the Mediterranean water mass that arrives in the Azores in between 800 and 1,000 meters, the deep North Atlantic deep water, and the Eastern North Atlantic central water. But what exists in the benthic, on the seafloor in the Azores, that it makes so different? Well, first, we are a deep sea area. Our backyard, it's the deep sea. We are above a chain of seamounts that are associated to the mid-Atlantic ridge. And those seamounts, those hard substrates on the flanks, on the summits, they have cold water coral gardens and reefs. They have sponge aggregations, hydrothermal vent fields, and in the basins or in the base of the seamounts or in the base of the slopes of the islands, we might have soft sediment. And these cold water gardens and these sponge aggregations and the hydrothermal vent fields, they are structuring habitats very important for other species, and some of them are considered vulnerable to anthropogenic impacts. So the overall demonstration project tries to connect multidisciplinary deep observations to provide information to observations of the benthic biology and also in the water column, and ultimately feed the governance to enhance the marine spatial planning to ensure a sustainable use in the area. And why the sponge aggregations? Well, the sponge aggregation, it was recently discovered in the Azores, but and the importance of these sponges was in the past minimized, but we have been observing that they can be quite dense, and the functions that they provide to the deep ecosystem are very important. First, they can be food source, not only from the sponge tissue itself, but also from the trapped material that they can have in their matrix. Also, they are able to do carbon transfer. We know that some of these sponges, they can use dissolved organic carbon and transform it in particulate organic carbon, which is very important to feed other animals. They are very important on the bentopelagic coupling. They might serve as refuge for several species. They are nursery grounds for other invertebrates. We have been observing that there are a lot of small crustaceans that use these sponges as nursery grounds. They are habitat provisioning for species that live above hard substrate like corals and hydroids, and we'll be finding above these sponges. And they are really, really important for the nutrient cycle for carbon, nitrogen. And these sponges that we have been observing are glass sponges, so they are very important for the silica. And how do we study these sponges? Well, first we start knowing where they are. And the first data, it was from a bycatch of fisheries, and then we have been discovered them using towed cameras, ROVs, and submersibles. And now we have been using the fisheries, well, the bottom long lines, because in the Azores, trawling is forbidden. Sometimes when they touch the seafloor, they bring a sponge. So we start understanding where these sponges are. And using scientific projects and submersibles, we can go and sample, observe, collect water, do biogeochemical measurements, collect sediments, and the sponges themselves. This is the Lula submersible that was based here in the Azores for a few years. And this is the Luso ROV from the task force from the extension of the continental shelf from Portugal, with which we have been doing some work on these sponge grounds. And what are the environmental factors that drive the broad-scale distribution of this Pheronema carpenteri sponge ground? Well, it might be the geomorphology of the bottom, the circulation patterns, but also the water column biogeochemical conditions. And we can think that the global ocean could be seen as a mosaic of distinct seascapes, and the seascapes englobed the hydrodynamic, the seafloor, and the water column. And the organisms, they have a strong habitat selection. They don't live everywhere. The distribution of the adults, of the juveniles, and where the eggs and the larvae go, it's closely affected by the dynamic of the water dimensions of the ocean. However, we don't fully still understand the drivers. And the seafloor structures, of course, they provide substrate, refuge from predation. And but the seascapes and the habitats, they are primarily structured by the properties of the ocean liquid. So a chemical perspective in the last years is being successfully applied mainly on the pelagic environment. But we are trying to apply this to the deep sea by using measure local chemical distributions to understand the process in the sea. So Claudia, first she started to try to implement an hydrodynamic model here in the Azores and a biogeochemical model. And she has done that at two levels. So the first level, which is a 2D barotrophic model, which is man-tight. And then on the level 2 and levels 2 and level 3, she has implemented the hydrodynamic and the biogeochemical model. The hydrodynamic goes for water temperature, salinity, density, and velocity in 3 dimensions. And the biogeochemical model, basically, she was implementing and running for dissolved oxygen, nutrients, phytoplankton, and diatoms. And she has been using MOHID as a model and different open boundary conditions for the climatology, the meteo, and for the water properties, the Howe and the CMEMS. And these are just some of the results that we have for around 750 meters, which is on the bathymetric distribution of this sponge. And you can see that it changed along during the year. And we can observe sometimes some upwelling. It's the blue color, which is the cold water that comes in the surface. And here on the salinity, this is temperature, this is salinity. We can see sometimes in most dark here, the Mediterranean water arriving. When we go to the oxygen and to the silica, we are still processing some of these data. We can see that it's not an homogeneous, there are really differences. This is oxygen in October 2017. You can see that we have different levels of oxygen, and the pink dots are the distribution of the sponges. And here is the dissolved silica, and we have here the distribution of the sponges. So we are trying to understand if the distribution is related, it's really related, or the settling is related to the biogeochemical, in which periods, and if the larvae are using the different water masses with different properties. Here it's another chapter that we are working. It's how are the different sponge fields connected? And we have been using the hydrodynamic model and the particle tracking model, and we can see where the larvae they go, and we are trying to infer if it's related also to the biogeochemical properties of the water. Here these are static, and we don't know if the reproduction is continuous or seasonal, but so we are creating different scenarios. But when we are using models, one of the things that we need to do is validate the models. And if we use the UVs, oxygen, salinity, and temperature, using the Argo buoys, oceanographic cruises, and scientific projects, we have a lot of data, a lot of depth profiles. But when we go to the other EUVs like nutrients, we can see that from 1993 to 2011, there were just 8 locations where we can have nutrients data and 2 ocean observatories, one that is on outside the area of study and the other one which is another hydrothermal vent field. So we are really in need of having biogeochemical data, continuous time series, more data in deeper layers, and more data for model validation. And these data will not just feed the models, but will improve the calibration and validation of those models. It will make us have a better understanding of the dynamics and characterize them and optimize the studies for biology, population, and ecosystems. So we need to have more measurements in the water column, on the benthic biogeochemistry, on the sponge grounds, and with a higher resolution to assess the larva transport. And with that, I give the word to my colleague Felix that will talk about the toolboxes to do those measurements in the deep ocean. Thank you for your attention.
So, give me a second. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I will just continue where Anna left the story. So thanks again for inviting us, and welcome to the second part of the presentation. I will introduce some technologies for biogeochemistry observations that were just mentioned by Anna. And as she said, these would help to characterize the environmental conditions of the Azores ecosystems, like the sponge grounds we just heard about. Sorry, I have to look at my notes every now and then, otherwise I will just need too long. I will start with technologies for chemical observations in the water column and then move on to particles and finally to the seafloor. So there's a lot of things to show, and I'm sorry if this is a little bit of a tour de force through technology. In the water column, measurements of oxygen, the carbonate system, nutrients, as well as other solutes are key to understand the environment where the deep fauna lives in, but also to address productivity and element cycling in the water column. Luckily, there are a number of small low power sensors available that allow for long-term observations, for example, with biogeochemical Argo floats. By changing buoyancy, these floats can adjust to a certain water depth. And after some days of drifting, they typically take a vertical profile all the way up to the sea surface, send off their data, and return back to their drifting depth. And they do that again and again. Biogeochemical Argo floats host sensors for oxygen, nitrate, and pH to address nutrient availability, productivity, oxygenation, as well as acidification. In addition, particle concentration and chlorophyll A content are quantified. I will talk about these items later. And more sensors are in the planning for the future to fully characterize the carbonate system, shown down here. And here is an example of where a single float recorded oxygen for almost 2 years in the North Atlantic. The data show strong dynamics that are associated with patterns of circulation and productivity, and of course with the movement of the float itself. Biogeochemical variables that cannot be measured with sensors at the required precision can be addressed with lab-on-a-chip technologies. So what are these? These are basic laboratory methods that are miniaturized. And in this example of the nitrate and nitrite sensor, all the mixing of samples and reagents, the chemical reactions and the measurements take place on this disk that is not even 10 centimeters in diameter. Lab-on-a-chip technologies exist for a number of solutes already, including more nutrients, micronutrients, and carbonate system species. In this example, nitrate was recorded with the lab-on-a-chip sensors during a glider deployment in the Celtic Sea for 3 weeks, for a period of 3 weeks in spring. And the reduction of nitrate that you see here in the upper water column nicely matches the increase in primary productivity in that same time that is visible in the chlorophyll content. In another example, similar instruments here in yellow have been deployed with moorings in the Arctic and did a nice record of nitrate and nitrite over a period of almost a year. I will now move on to technologies for the observation of particles in the water column, and the focus will be on particulate organic matter. So organic matter produced by microalgae in the sunlit surface layer sinks as export flux to the deep, where it becomes the primary food source to sustain benthic fauna. And while sinking down, these particles undergo a complex combination of processes. And a key aim, and a somewhat simplistic aim of particle observations, is to quantify how vertical fluxes decrease with depth. This is shown in this schematic, but also in this classical data example from the Northeast Pacific Ocean. So how do we measure these? The standard equipment is moored particle traps. Particles that sink into a funnel or cylinder are collected in sampling cups for later analysis in the lab to address fluxes and seasonal patterns. The traps are typically deployed, as you see here, as part of a mooring at different water depth. By their nature, particle traps provide only very limited information on size of particles and their structure, and no information whatsoever on their sinking speed. So there's more recent developments that provide more insights and also reduce sampling artifacts. And these developments include drifting particle traps that actually collect particles while drifting with a water body. And sampling in gel cups allows to microscopic analysis of the nature and structure and size of natural particles and larger aggregates. With imaging technologies, the structure and composition of particles can be studied without even sampling them. This can be either done with high-resolution cameras as ship-based systems, or with miniaturized systems that also allow for time series observations. Some instruments combine particle observation and sampling. For example, this biooptical platform is basically a moored standard trap, but on top of that, it has a camera that observes the particles while they sink through a settling tube, addressing the sinking speed. Data obtained in northern, temperate, and subtropical Atlantic show a large variety of particle composition sizes, as well as of sinking velocities. The final part of the presentation addresses technologies to observe biogeochemical conditions and processes directly at the seafloor. So the observations aim to understand, again, the environmental conditions at the sites, for example, where sponges and other benthic fauna are living, but they also help to quantify their biogeochemical functions that were mentioned by Anna. For example, organic matter degradation and nutrient recycling. Observations of biogeochemical conditions in sediments and benthic fluxes across the surface of the sediments can be obtained with benthic chambers that you see in this very bad image here, or with microsensors down here. The focus is typically on oxygen, as this serves as a proxy for organic matter remineralization. However, with chambers, you can measure any solute you have a sensor for, you can address in samples that are taken throughout the deployment. And with sediment oxygen profiles recorded with microsensors, like this example here, resolve the redox gradient and are also used to calculate diffusive oxygen fluxes. Autonomous benthic landers can deploy chambers as well as microsensor profiles at the seafloor and return to the surface after they did that. In the animation, you see oxygen microsensors are lowered at sub-millimeter resolution into the seafloor. Such sensors also exist for other properties like sulfide, pH, and redox potential, and others. These same instruments can also be installed on benthic crawlers. As these crawlers are able to move in between measurements to a fresh sediment patch, time series of flux recordings are possible with these instruments. MBARI's benthic rover was the first system to carry out long-term benthic oxygen flux observations with chambers, and you see the chambers here in front of the vehicle. This example shows 1 year of observations from the Northeast Pacific Ocean at 4,000 meter water depth. Oxygen fluxes that are shown here in the lower graph actually show a high temporal variability, which nicely matches the variability in food input as particulate organic matter and remains of cells. In seafloor ecosystems with hard substrates, complex structures, and high abundances of large fauna, like the ones introduced by Anna, oxygen fluxes can still be quantified with the aquatic eddy covariance technology. Flow and oxygen are recorded simultaneously at the same spot above the seabed and used to quantify the net oxygen transport towards the seafloor. The technique can also record fluxes of any other solute where you have a sensor for that is sufficiently precise and fast. Here's an example where eddy covariance technology was used to obtain oxygen fluxes at a vertical hard bottom wall in southwest Greenland fjord system that was dominated by filtering holothurians. And you see even that was possible. I end the presentation with this example of a study from the Arctic with aquatic eddy covariance instruments attached to landers at 2,500 meter water depth. It could be shown that it was actually possible with this technique to resolve the very, very low oxygen fluxes as they are found in very many deep sea areas. So they could be resolved successfully with this technology. So to draw some conclusions for the overall presentation, both parts of it, there's a strong need to better understand the distribution of complex and potentially vulnerable ecosystems in the Azores to inform management of multiple ocean uses. Observing technologies that you need for that are available to provide biogeochemical context to fauna studies and to contribute to a multidisciplinary deep ocean demonstration project or use case. The next step will be to develop a demonstration project outline as the basis for scientists, institutions, funding and governmental agencies, as well as the private sector to engage. So feel free to drop an email to the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy to take part in this or receive more information. And with this, I would like to thank the organizers again to have us here and all of you for your attention, of course. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna and Felix, for these great presentations. We have time for a couple of questions, and I'd like to see whether, especially from the attendees, I'm hoping see whether there are any questions from the attendees. I think you should be able to, not sure, you are either unmute yourself. If not, you can type your questions into the Q&A box, which you should have. So please, please do so. Maybe just to get some discussion started, maybe a question for you, Felix. So in order to make some of these measuring methods fully autonomous, I think the big gap, or not the gap, but an impediment is that for many of these, you have to bring samples back to the laboratory, right, in order to be able to analyze them. And if that's correct, are there any attempts, or is there a possibility that one could do something like similar to edge computing, whether one does an edge analysis where, in fact, the analysis can be miniaturized in such a way that they can be performed on board, so to speak, in situ, and all that you then have to send back would be the data, which would be really the kind of the Argo paradigm. Is something like this even conceivable, or is the lab going to be indispensable?
So from the like almost all technologies I showed are either already in place in the form of autonomous instrumentation. There's a difference, of course, like if it's something that is bulky and has to go on an AUV will not, at the current technology status, will not stay forever. But all I showed was actually based on sensing in situ. So I guess the bottleneck there is almost all The bottleneck there is I guess for something like you have in mind is then really transmission of data to the surface. I mean, and then through the shore lab. In case of the Argo or biogeochemical Argo floats, that is part of the system that they send off the data. But for the other instruments, it's quite complex. There are solutions to that. Like the MOMAR observatory in the Azores region, they do measurements at depth, but at the same time they transmit to a surface unit to shore, at least selected data. So there are solutions to that, but then of course it gets very complicated. And one of the slides I actually threw out, there is of course things you cannot analyze yet. Like, for example, I would not be aware that you can count plastic particles in situ, or also doing DNA analysis in situ are still in a very early stage. But there's of course automated samplers, and you can fix samples in situ, and you can sediment samples is a question still, but water column samples you can do. It's really it's off the shelf technology basically. You would still to pick them up and analyze them, but yeah, you would have the samples that actually can be used to construct a time series even when you're not there.
I just want to add something to what Felix was saying, is that even if everything is autonomous, you need to calibrate and to validate your measurements. So from time to time, you still need to do sampling in order to calibrate your sensors and to validate your results.
Yeah,
that's of course true. Yeah.
And that will remain true even for Argo. That's still, even today, cross-calibration with CTDs is still an important step for, especially for the deep values of Argo, for deep Argo floats. We have one question actually in the Q&A from a participant, Davide Gamboa. Are traps shown, the ones that have been shown, also efficient with particulates such as sediment or plastic?
Yeah, so generally the traps can trap everything that sinks if things really float. Like for example, we in our group we look into microorganisms, and if they are single cell, then they would basically not sink. So there we would rather go for either sampling the water or sampling filters in situ, like do a filtration in situ and then fix the filters. Everything that settles will settle in these traps. But there are, I had a slide on that, actually I had to throw it out. There are problems with hydrodynamics in these funnels, and if they get inclined by the current, then they do not trap or collect the particles very efficient anymore. So there's a lot of debate on that. Also, in some cases, the particles you would need, organic matter you would need to sustain the respiration you see at the seafloor, they often don't match. So you don't get enough particles in your traps to actually feed the seafloor to an extent that can explain your respiration rates. So there are problems. And one of the solutions is actually, which makes life much more complicated for the observation, is these drifting traps, because you have to recover them and they drift away. So you have to go back. You have to follow them actually with your research vessel in order to recollect them. But they will not have this current going over them because they go with the flow. And so that seems to be a solution for that. And I believe that even plastic particle studies have been done already with those, or actually are in the planning at least.
Okay. Is there any questions from maybe other panelists? Otherwise, I don't see any more questions, and if that's not the case, well, thank you again, Anna and Felix, for these excellent talks. And with that, we will move on to our second speaker, Dr. Andrew Thurber. Thank you so much for joining us and for presenting today. Just a quick introduction. So Andrew Thurber is an associate professor in the College of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences, and in the Department of Microbiology in the College of Sciences at Oregon State University. His research focuses on deep sea and polar soft sediment habitats, looking at the trophic linkages between microbes, metazoans in the marine habitats, and how that impacts ecosystem function. He has a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from the Hawaii Pacific Institute, a Master's in Marine Sciences from California State University, I'm sorry, and a PhD in Oceanography from UC San Diego. And with that, the floor or the screen is yours, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can you hear me okay and see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Great. So thanks a lot. I'm very honored to be here. And essentially what I wanted to talk to you today about is discuss how some of the measurements that Anna and Felix can really help feed our fundamental understanding about deep sea process and sort of catch us up to date on what we know about the deep sea and really what we need to keep in mind as we contemplate this decade of ocean science and really its fundamental focus on sustainable development. So essentially what I'm going to tell you today is when we think about the deep sea, we're talking about the majority of the world. It's also much more diverse than we often think about. It's much more connected than we often think about. And it is fundamentally tied to a functioning planet and a healthy society, whether you're a coastal community or not. The other aspect of the deep sea, which I'll emphasize, is that processes occur slowly and they're very much interconnected. Now, one of the things that's really amazing is also how the Azores fits into this. And so at the end and sort of throughout, I'll touch on some of these, how the Azores has really led research for this. But the take-home message that I hope you'll get is the deep sea is really part of a functioning planet and all of our economies. And in the context of sustainable development, what do we need to know about the deep sea when we're contemplating its potential variety of different use scenarios that are going to confront us in the next 1, 5, 10, and 100 years, and how we need to understand the basic functioning of the deep sea to truly make informed management decisions. Now, I say I'm going to say what we've learned in the last 100 years of deep sea science, but I'm barely going to scratch the surface on that, but hopefully I'll provide some context. First off, I love this particular map. When I talk about the deep sea, I talk about everything deeper than 200 meters water depth. 63.5, 64% of the blue planet falls in this range that is the deep sea, with the deep pelagic being one of the largest biomes on the planet by a massive amount. So we're really talking about, when we're talking about the deep sea, we're talking about the globe. The Azores absolutely fits into this. And even though it's sort of cut off on this map, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian, and the Southern Ocean all are significant basins of connected deep sea science. I really like to emphasize the diversity of the deep sea and connected. And so I think what I'll do is I'll start sort of by introducing some of the main habitats that we talk about. They're continental shelves, and here I'm drawing the different bathymetry. There are essentially continental margins that are excised with many submarine canyons. There are abyssal plains, which are what the Azores comes out of. And then there's hydrothermal vents, where you have two different plate structures being pulled apart from each other, creating areas of release of a lot of energy out of the deep sea through hydrothermal fluid, which then also connect and conform things like seamounts, even islands. Oh, that island is taking a bit of an odd shape. That would be an unstable island. And then they lead over to trench systems that can also be areas of plate boundaries and further hydrothermal vent areas. Now, the Azores is a really exciting place because it really encompasses all of these key habitats right here between the island region, the margins, seamounts. So there's more than 400 seamounts in the Azores Plateau Crater, as well as the hydrothermal vents. In addition, this is abutted right up against the European margin, and the European margin has many different methane seeps. These are areas where the greenhouse gas methane is released from the vast reservoirs in the seafloor, which fuels a variety of different habitats. And all of these essentially connect in a variety of different ways. Now, as Felix brought up, when we think about deep sea habitats, we often think about the importance of photosynthetic production, fueling them and defining what happens in these habitats. Photosynthesis captures CO2, pulls it out of the atmosphere, turns it into biomass, and then you have phytoplankton and other things, even dead fish, or whales, sinking to the seafloor and fueling all of the different biodiversity and biomass that's there. And so we spent a lot of time trying to better understand and even model how this can structure globally and locally different benthic habitats in the deep sea. Increasingly, we're appreciating the magnitude and massive impact that chemosynthetic production has, also on deep sea habitats, balancing this input of photosynthetic production. One reason for that is if we think about the water column and we think about depth on the y-axis, and we think about sunlight, so areas that can actually have photosynthesis, it essentially precipitously declines where you can no longer have sunlight below in the deepest, clearest water of the world, 200 meters water depth, which is essentially why we consider everything deeper than that the deep sea. Chemosynthetic production provides energy. It essentially captures chemicals being released from the seafloor, or even degradation products of things like sinking whales, fish, and algae that can then capture CO2 in the seafloor and provide new biomass to fuel these deep habitats. Traditionally, we've thought about these as methane seeps and hydrothermal vents, but we're appreciating that this occurs everywhere, including large swaths of the abyssal plain. Now, when I talk about connectedness, I think hydrothermal vents are a great example of it. We often study right at the epicenters of these hydrothermal vents, but they form plumes that can spread out more than 10,000 kilometers, connecting and crossing ocean basins. Further emphasizing that these are very much connected habitats and ecosystems, in addition to being diverse. The other component of the deep sea, when we start thinking about what it does to society, and we talked about sensors like nitrate sensors, nitrate that's brought up from the deep sea, including by oceanographic processes that increase and can increase around seamounts and islands. So this would be different nutrients like nitrate, can lead to the additional formation of oxygen, which then essentially fuels the air we breathe, as well as pretty much all animal life on the planet. And globally, the oceans account for about 50% of all oxygen produced. So very important. So I hope what I'm giving you some insight into is there's many different processes. These are connected, and the deep sea is not just sort of mud. It's also vast. So here's a variety of different habitats on a global scale indicated in the area kilometers squared, except for the pelagic or the deep water column, which is in kilometers cubed. And what you can see is that if we take a variety of different things we may be more familiar with, Portugal, there's actually more area of vents and seeps globally than there is Portugal. There's more fjords than Texas, and there's more canyons, ridges, continental margins, and abyssal plains that fall within the deep sea than all of North America. And of course, the abyssal plains are much larger than all land on Earth, 63 to 64% of the planet. So the deep sea is a huge environment made up of many different regions. Now, I think when many of us think of the deep sea, we think about this. We think about some sort of fuzzy, muddy image out of the front of a submersible, and that's very exciting from an exploration standpoint, but it doesn't necessarily capture the excitement of the general public. And even when the imagery gets better and you have things like this sea urchin, which looks like a nose and is actually its scientific names refers to the fact that it looks like a nose, there's a variety of different biodiverse and biological habitats that occur even on the muddy seafloor. Few are more exciting than I don't think many people say than holothurian, sea cucumbers, which have taken all sorts of different growth forms to be able to live pretty much at all ocean depths, and in many cases be some of the dominant animals as you go deeper and deeper in the ocean. Now, each one of the habitats that I mentioned also adds habitat diversity, which leads to biodiversity, which can impact how it may or may not be used looking forward. Now, Anna talked about sponge gardens. Here's some images of different sponge and cold water coral gardens. These are taken off the west coast of the US, where I do a variety of my work, but similar habitats are found globally. These are important for fisheries production. In many cases, they're considered essential fish habitat or other designations to make them critical for preservation to continued economic production of deep sea fisheries and surface water fisheries. Canyons are an area that provide that, in addition to places like seamounts. I talked about how many other things sink besides algae, and this is an example of a rotting whale on the seafloor where there's a variety of different habitats and biodiversity around it. This is a 3D mosaic. If you go to the Nautilus Live and look up a 3D whale mosaic, you can actually spin this diagram around and see all of the different habitats that occur just around a rotting, sinking whale. These add biodiversity in the oceans. Methane seeps common on the continental margins, especially in the Gulf of Cadiz. There's an amazing amount of research that's gone on there. Also add biodiversity and habitat diversity to the ocean ecosystem. And of course, hard substrate in any form. This was an example from methane seeps, provides places for sponges to settle, corals to settle, things like octopods to be present on, as well as hagfish, rockfish, things that are commercially harvested. In other words, these fundamentally shape the overall biodiversity of the ocean and also function of the ocean by making things different habitats than just mud. Each one of these create the holistic function of the ocean, which then feeds, and I'll explain how, into a more functioning society and economies. Now, hydrothermal vents are really amazing and compelling habitats, and the ones off the Azores are no different. They have areas with massive bubbling black smokers, superheated water being released. They cover a variety of different water depths. This is sort of a compilation of hydrothermal vents from around the world, but there's a different sort of symbiont bearing shrimp that are present there. And vents were one of these discoveries that not only provided novel insight into how our planet works, but also started to capture the imagination of people and public and get people excited on a more artistic and educational sense to what happens in the deep sea. I often think some of the documentaries and the initial discovery of the hydrothermal vent created a whole avenue and new realm of scientists or people interested in science that were not appreciative of it prior to that. They're also very pretty. Now, when we talk about modeling and why we want to understand this, this is a compilation put together by Chilean Way. And essentially what it shows is that with increasing water depth, largely due to particles being scavenged and consumed as they sink, we see less and less biomass, less and less animals with increasing water depth. And we're talking about modeling and trying to get a holistic understanding when we think about the decade. This is a really compelling plot because it allows us to take essentially, and here we do have literally almost a century worth of deep sea data with biomass on a log scale on the y-axis versus depth. And you can see that animals that are very small, bigger, and essentially identifiable by a camera or a submersible, all of them decrease precipitously with increasing water depth. Bacteria less so, and bacteria are some of the biogeochemical movers and shakers, and it's interesting that they don't actually decrease with depth. Processes change. However, this has been successfully moved to actually model a sort of a holistic understanding of our deep sea, which is very much tied to this basic understanding of food drives what's there. The deposition of food is really important, and things like islands and seamounts that modify where primary productivity is or capture food as it's passing by can change sort of our basic understanding of deep sea habitats. Now, I think a common question that is asked, or at least when people talk about the deep sea, is why should I care? Why, as a person who lives in the middle of a country, care what happens in the deep sea because it's dark and I'll never go there? And so something that is really important is trying to communicate what the deep sea does for society to something that everybody can sort of relate to. One approach to that is using this overarching framework called ecosystem services, which is a very sort of me-centric, what do I get from a habitat? But it's important to regulators and managers because it provides sort of the basic understanding that they can then use to make informed decisions about what happens if I do one thing versus another thing, or essentially regulate a fishery or not. Now, these have more specific names for ecosystem function frameworks, but I like to think of it as, what do I get from the environment? How does this impact a fundamentally functioning planet? And then also, what are some other benefits? And I talked about hydrothermal vents can excite people about education, get people into science, or just inform us about the functioning of the planet, or even inform and get people excited about tourism. And one of the things I think is really excited about observatories is when you put a camera at someplace, when you start providing real-time data, you can start getting armchair scientists, people who would normally not have any access to be able to access these databases or even this entire realm, all of a sudden can, on a daily basis, join scientists as they're exploring or as making discoveries of the planet and learn and participate in that process, including through citizen science expertise. Now, I'm going to talk through a few of these, especially how they relate to the region we're talking about, but I'd like to keep in mind that there's many different benefits and things that we can and will be asked increasingly to decide whether or not we want the deep sea to be used for that or not. So we've been harvesting food from the deep sea for a very long time. Off my coast of significant proportion of ground fish are actually harvested from the deep sea. And in certain places, it's a well-regulated and sustainable economy, but it has to be well-regulated, and many of them are not. And one of the reasons is the deep sea, and I talked about how little food gets there and how that's deterministic in what's present. It doesn't provide a lot of energy, and it leads to a variety of different fish species that grow very slowly, can essentially don't reproduce till much later in life, even than humans. And so when you remove the fish, it's not really fishing, and in some cases it's even concerned mining, because you can remove that entire population, so it may or may not be able to recover. There are sustainable fisheries. This is an image actually from a methane seep off the coast. These are black cod. This is a big economy for coastal fisheries. It's even considered one of the more sustainable fisheries by oversight agencies. And so it's just identifying what and how one can harvest from the deep sea to be able to have sustainable exploitation of habitats, because two species are not the same. I also think talking about the Azores, Dr. Telma Morado is really one of the leaders on understanding deep sea fishing. And so it's always a great place to be able to approach a real fundamental understanding of deep sea fishing and habitats. Many of them are not sustainable. And so a very keen eye needs to be taken when deciding who and where and how things are accessed. Now, fisheries also are impacted by chemosynthetic production, which I process. This is more of an emerging concept. This is a particular crab species that is a charismatic one, because methane is bubbling up from the seafloor, and it's unfortunately not mobile enough to notice that methane is building up underneath it. It acts sort of like a balloon, picks it up and drops it on its head. And this particular one was essentially shown to be an example of a snow crab as it's sold, to be able to take chemosynthetic energy and translate it into an economic resource that can be harvested and is harvested. This takes place at a methane seep off the coast of North America. However, Dr. Colaço has published about how some of the crab species off the Azores actually have been seen harvesting energy from the hydrothermal vents there by consuming mussels. And so this again is more of an increasingly appreciated route of chemosynthetic production making its way onto our dinner table. I also like to add that in this particular case, as well as the other ones, these are not toxic. You don't need to worry about consuming species that might be getting energy from vents and seeps, which is a commonly asked question. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about biodiversity, and biodiversity sort of impacts people in two ways. One, there's a group of people that want to conserve biodiversity because it excites them that there is such a diverse planet around them, as a great way to view the world. Another are more interested in how biodiversity, how is it important and what can it provide for us? One of the things that biodiversity provides is the ability for novel discovery of future biopharmaceuticals, biotechnological compounds, also known as marine genetic resources, also known as natural products. But what these are essentially different compounds and solutions that may solve our current and future medical as well as societal challenges. Detergents that work at colder temperatures, saving energy bills and reducing our carbon footprint. There's a variety of different medicinal uses, and in fact, 50% of cancer treatments were first discovered in nature before they were essentially synthesized or modified, so we can use them to treat one of the most devastating illnesses globally. There's not been as much research on the deep sea as in other regions, but currently 75% of the deep sea products that were essentially extracted were bioactive and provide some potential excitement for societal use. And this is something where we're looking for biodiversity. We're looking for taxa that haven't been studied. We're looking for microbes fighting with other microbes to find those molecules that they're using to be able to knock out the other ones. And that allows us to do things like find novel antimicrobial compounds, antibiotics, antifungal compounds, which essentially can also catch us up in the arm race as we have increasing antibiotic resistance globally. So biodiversity actually creates a future societal benefit in addition to a future economic realms. There's a lot of discussion currently globally about different mining resources, hydrothermal vents, including those, some in the Azores region and exclusive economic zones, do have polymetallic sulfides. These have different compounds that may feed into our new electric cars, our cell phones, in addition to just the general need for metals and precious metals. Globally, it is a very hot topic. This is a map from the International Seabed Authority showing where all the hydrothermal vents that have these are present. And that is something that we as a society are going to be asked to deal with. And I think it's important to notice that this removes hard substrate, and it can have a variety of different impacts because of the connectedness that is the deep sea. Another thing we may or may not be asked, but most likely will, is what about methane? It's another thing we might be able to physically take from the deep sea. There's more methane in the ocean than there are fossil fuel reserves left in it. Currently, we're technologically limited on being able to access the probably more than 1,000 gigatons of carbon of methane that's stored in continental margins globally. But that's something that's being and has been actively worked on for a variety of different ways. One of the challenging things is that it is a potent greenhouse gas, 25 times or more efficient than CO2 at warming our atmosphere. So we really want it to be kept in the deep sea. And one of the great things we get from the deep sea as part of a functioning planet mindset is that the microbes in the deep sea consume it for energy as a form of chemosynthetic production. And that means that even though there's a lot of methane in the ocean, it leaks out, very little of it actually makes it into the atmosphere. So it's a potentially important future use scenario, but it's also something that currently is keeping the planet inhabitable. Pretty much since time immemorial, we've been using the deep sea as a waste disposal location. It's still one, even though there are conventions that ban it. This is an example at 1,000 meters off the coast where you can see there's a red plastic cup that many people know from parties, in addition to casted fishing gear. Any kind of trash you can imagine, you can pretty much find in the deep sea. One of the aspects of it that really functions more into a functioning planet is that it is also absorbed and continues to absorb carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere. I think many of you will be familiar with this curve. This is the amount of CO2 that we put into the atmosphere as measured from the Mãnoa Observatory off Hawaii, and essentially the impact of anthropogenic CO2 on warming our atmosphere, oceans, and globe is well established. And this would be much more rampant if a third of this to a quarter of this had not already been absorbed by the deep sea, in part by movement of water, as well as the sinking of phytoplankton. So waste disposal is a very active component of it, not only as a place when we accidentally or on purpose dump things into it, or as well as just making sure that the CO2 in the atmosphere is better buried. Now, we talked about some of the fish species being very long-lived. If you want to talk about paradigms that seem to be broadly applicable and generally hold true for deep sea ecosystems, it is that things grow slowly and they are long-lived. That does not lend itself well to exploitation and use. And in context of the decade, I think something many of us constantly challenge with is what is sustainable development? What does it mean in the deep sea and compared to other regions? People have proposed that we don't use the term extraction, but instead use the word mining for things like any fishing that will remove cold water corals. Cold water corals can live for 100 years. Some of the vent and seep organisms live for hundreds of years. There's deep sea sponge species that have been estimated to live more than 1,000 years, with many of them on the scale of more than 100 to 200 years. So when we're making these decisions, it's really important to understand that it's not something in most cases that's going to come back in 1, 5, or 10 years. And in many cases, our governments are mandated to be able to have sustainable development, which mining is not always considered a part of. These are the decisions we as a society will have to make. Now, I also think it's really important to, when we think about the global ocean, it is inclusive of all regions. Water does not know when an exclusive economic zone starts or stops. It also can have broad-reaching implications, and especially when water moves so slowly, taking about 1,000 years to go from the North Atlantic to the North Pacific, processes do not quickly recover. Now, what I've shown on this figure is essentially a variety of different processes which fall under these broad contexts of ecosystem services, societal benefits, as well as ecosystem functions, what happens in the deep sea, and connected those with these lines, essentially showing that certain ones, CO2 storage, for example, is very much impacted to other things, carbon sequestration, which is a societal benefit. Many of the different components, things we benefit from or could take from the deep sea, When we do that, it has a variety of different cascading impacts, which are hard to quantify. And in many ways, that's why observing systems are so crucial, because we're fundamentally shifting how many of these habitats work simply by changing the ocean temperature, which we have been doing for a while. How is that going to have a variety of different ramifications? And we can't know that unless we actually look. We can model, we have, and it looks like those impacts are going to be widespread. So again, management requires a fundamental understanding of the impacts, but the impacts are both long-lasting, widespread, and connected to a variety of different benefits that we get from these habitats. Now, I'm showing you a lot of images from a variety of different Pacific habitats, but much of the research ties very much into what's gone on in the Azores. Hydrothermal vent research is really these different hydrothermal vent fields are the epicenters of discovery and fundamental understanding about how hydrothermal vent systems fit into the function of the ocean. The example I provided, one of those examples from Dr. Colaço about how harvested crabs do get energy from hydrothermal vents, and also a variety of different discoveries about photosynthetic production, balancing chemosynthetic production areas that we thought were all chemosynthetic production, advances in fundamental what microbes are doing what, as well as a variety of topics about methane seep understanding have all happened within the Azores or in the adjacent European margin for the methane seep stuff. From seamounts and litter, this is also just an absolute epicenter of research. And so I think it's really important to realize that this is one of those areas that is connected to the globe. And it's been sort of a laboratory that's provided insight to the functioning that we then apply globally to better understand our ocean ecosystems. So I'm out of time, but what I'd really like to finish up with is I hope that you've understand that the deep sea is part of society. We get many things from it. An inhabitable planet, it mitigates our impact, our carbon footprint, it provides us air to breathe. And we're going to be increasingly tasked to ask which one of the services we are going to want to either use and invoke from a material benefit, but the ramifications that may have on, a functioning planet or other things. Impacts are long lasting, and the decisions that we make on this context, especially within this next decade, are not going to be the decisions for the decade, but really it's the decisions that are for our children and our children's children moving forward. So we should try to make sure they're informed. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time, thank funders, and I've really enjoyed all the collaborations which I've had with some of the panelists on this, and also just the Azores region has been such an epicenter of research. I've learned a lot from the research that's gone on there throughout my career. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I especially loved your tangled web of services. Can't remember the exact title, but really showing the interdependence between all the different stressors and ecosystem functions. And again, the floor is open for questions. And while hopefully, please, especially the attendees, please do ask questions in the Q&A. And just to get things started, maybe one question I have that relates maybe to this tangled web. There's a lot of talk about the ocean as sort of a contributor to climate solutions, as a solution space, of course, with offshore wind energy and sort of carbon capturing. And I suspect that the deep sea in that context is in a lot of people's mind. And do you have any thoughts about this tension between potential, for example, carbon capture or other sort of technologies and their impact on the sustainability of the deep ocean?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And honestly, it's one that I really struggle with because we need to find climate solutions. And whereas in many ways, personally, I would not like that solution to be in the deep sea because of the experience that I've had. There may be solutions that are best done in the deep sea. And so I think with all of those sort of approaches to carbon capture or there's many different approaches, including trying to stimulate photosynthetic production to try to have greater burial in the deep sea. It's really understanding and trying to understand how that could impact other services that we get, and then take and apply that same sort of mindset to other habitats in other regions to see where the best balance is from a global standpoint. And that's something that we really struggle with. So there's a variety of different international groups that are trying to sort of work and see what we know about the deep sea and which one of these could be potentially high risk and high reward enough to really make a dent in the climate problems that we've been presented with, and which ones are more likely to exacerbate problems or lead to greater issues. So we try to move forward with eyes wide open. But I think if you talk to, one of the great challenges, if you talk to any scientist, they don't want you to use their habitat to solve our climate issues, but at the same time, one of them needs to be used. And so I think the more informed we can be with those decisions, the better that would be. I'd actually love to hear Anna's thoughts on that too, because she's involved with some of those international discussions as well.
Yeah, please, any of the panelists, if you have anything to add to this discussion, feel free, or also to the panelists, if you have any follow-up questions.
Yeah, I would have a question, Andrew. Great talk. Thanks a lot. I love this drawing, this live drawing. That was very good. So a question I had, you showed convincingly with images. You made the point that actually, if you have a very structured environment, it's obvious that boosts biodiversity. You provide all these niches and organisms can settle and stuff. So if we look at these boring abyssal plains, we still find a vast biodiversity of the infauna. So how does that work? Is that, like, do we miss the right scales when we look at niches, or is there other mechanisms in place that actually allow a high biodiversity in something, in an environment that looks so even to our eyes?
Yeah, thank you, Felix. That is opening a 30 to 40 year debate that's gone on, because, and I really appreciate the question, because when I talked about biodiversity, I talked about how habitat diversity and larger fauna, but as you go down in water depth, you do get increased biodiversity of small animals, and in addition to microbial taxa and things like that. So there's increased biodiversity with depth, which is a really important point, which I did not mention. Now, the reason why it is, I think, still baffles science. And there's been a variety of different thoughts that it could be because there's so little energetic input, that if you perturb an environment, and by perturb, it could be simply one of those little nose-shaped urchins grazing over the top of it, it creates a sort of bulldozer effect that can create many sort of micro niches. And so we do look at it on the wrong scale for the animal, because it's just a sort of mass of different stages of disturbance, like viewing a variety of different volcanism landmarks over time. But I think that the debate is still out why we do see such incredible biodiversity, especially in the abyssal plains, because it sure looks in many ways sort of stable. On the other hand, I think as we've all seen, as you put cameras down, there's all sorts of biology actually happening in these state places that we think are stable, in addition to periodic, just massive inputs of photosynthetic food falling from the sea surface that also sort of creates a variety of different successional stages and impact stages. And that's sort of where I've fallen to why there's high biodiversity. But I don't think we as scientists have a good answer. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well.
I was thinking about all the functions that all of these different animals are doing, because when we talk about biodiversity, especially on these abyssal plains, we have a high number of species, but with low abundance. So we really need, and each species has its own function. It uses the environment differently. And this on such a vast environment as the abyssal plain, as you said, as fragmented as it is, because it cannot be forecast. The animals there, they don't know when they will have food, or when something will arrive in the bottom of the ocean. So everything is very, very slow. And sometimes they need I always think about the reproduction of these animals. Some of them, they are for a long time without doing anything. And then when they got food, they are able to reproduce. So I think this will make these patches and all of these different functions. So they had, but this is a huge discussion. The way they speciated or specialized in the abyssal plain has made they create being so diverse because they need to use differently the space, the big space. That's my feeling.
Great, thank you so much. I don't see any more questions. There's none in the Q&A. So, well, let's thank again. Thank you so much, Andrew, for this wonderful presentation, part 2 of this masterclass. And we will start part 2 with a presentation by Dr. Bruce Howe. Dr. Bruce Howe is a chair of the Joint Task Force for Smart Subsea Cables, and he's also a research professor at the University of Hawaii at Mãnoa. Bruce develops ocean observing infrastructure for the provision of power, communications, and positioning throughout the ocean volume, with an emphasis in terms of the technology on cabled and acoustic systems. As chair of the International Joint Task Force, JFT, on Smart Cable Initiative, which he's going to talk about, Dr. Howe is leading the effort to incorporate sensors into commercial transocean submarine telecommunication cables to form a planetary scale observing system for climate, ocean circulation, and sea level monitoring, and tsunami and earthquake warning. Past projects have included basin scale acoustic thermometry, planning, development, and operation of cabled observatories. At Station Aloha, 100 kilometers north of Oahu, Dr. Howe and his research team installed and operated the Aloha Cable Observatory, the world's deepest plug-and-play power and internet node on the planet at 4,700 meter water depth. Now, 10 years of continuous data have been collected here. After obtaining an engineering and oceanography degree at Stanford Universities and University of California at San Diego, Bruce has worked at the Applied Physics Lab, University of Washington since 2008, and at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Department of Ocean and Resource Engineering. And with that, the screen is yours, Bruce.
Okay, good. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can see it well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good, good. So yes, thanks for the introduction, and thank you all the Felix, Andrew, and Anna for your introductions too, and especially concerning the vastness of the abyssal ocean, the deep ocean. So SMART stands for Science Monitoring and Reliable Telecommunication, and I'm representing this joint task force, 170 people and 30 countries and 80 organizations in trying to implement this concept of adding sensors to commercial telecom cables. Commercial cables have been really the sole users of the deep abyssal ocean for the last 170 years. And so it's time to make use of that resource. So let's go on here. Yeah, let's see, wait a second. There, okay, so there's an outline here, what, why, how, and systems underway, including the Azores, Portugal and Azores, and then other steps. So this is kind of an overview slide. As Patrick says in the introduction, we really want to create a planetary scale network to provide power and internet connectivity on the seafloor around the planet, and with that power and communications, as was mentioned earlier, one of the real limitations is power. You know, if you have power, you can do almost anything, but long duration instruments and communication. So our mission is to implement this over ideally the ocean decade. And if we're successful, this truly will be a first order addition in the toolkit for oceanography and Earth observing. So the telecom industry is $5 billion a year, and there are roughly 1 million kilometers of active seafloor cable and 20,000 of these repeaters roughly every 70 kilometers. And so potentially as cables are replaced, refreshed, and new routes installed, we have the opportunity to install these sensors. With the understanding that the telecom remains the primary mission of these cable systems, and the smart sensor aspect is secondary. And the basic sensors we're talking about are bottom temperature, pressure, and seismic acceleration. Maybe, you know, in the out years, so to speak, one can think about other sensors and other ways of making more observations. We are benefiting the cable industry too by making these observations that will help protect cable systems from external aggression like fishing and trawling and anchors, and a better understanding of the environment they live in. So it is a two-way street. And the circles represent some of the systems under discussion, and especially the CAM system off Portugal, which will be installed in several years. So next, and here's the teaser. I'll cut to the chase sort of what's happening with respect to that system. CAM is Continent, Azores, Madeira Island, 3,700 kilometer cable with roughly 50 smart repeaters, and estimated cost of 120 million euros to be installed, ready for service in 2024. And it's a domestic system, but with international connections. A lot of what I'll talk about has been, you know, the details formulated by Leia, a group in Portugal, listening to the Earth under the Atlantic, led by Luis Matias and many others. So I want to give them credit for that. So just very schematically, you're all aware of this, but you know, the ocean observing tools consist of satellites. Those are absolutely essential to give the full spatial coverage of the Earth, but in most cases it's the very surface of the ocean. Then we have Argo floats, which are amazing and now carrying more and more sensors. Dart buoys, there are roughly 50, 60 of them around the world for tsunami warning primarily. And then we're suggesting we add cables along the seafloor to complement these other measurements and make measurements that are unobtainable any other way, like pressure, bottom pressure measurements and seismic measurements. So looking at those in a little more detail, the three observables, deep ocean temperature is increasing 50 millidegrees per year, roughly, or per decade, sorry. That's the red color in this map in the top left. And if we can measure that more precisely, we can better estimate the overall heat content of the ocean and thermal expansion of seawater that leads to sea level rise, which is regionally variable, shown in this middle plot. And sea level is rising at, on average, roughly 5 millimeters per year, and by the end of the century projected to be 8 millimeters per year. And there are extremely few measurements of ocean bottom pressure, none are long term. And then bottom pressure is a measure of ocean mass, the mass of water above the sensor, and so that is related directly to the amount of meltwater from land ice going into the ocean. And then pressure gradients across the ocean basins or between different topographic features, for instance, would provide the barotropic current estimates, which are largely unobserved by other means. And then finally, on the right side is the pressure, and the seismic measurements will absolutely help with tsunami warning and earthquake warning. And then in a more scientific way, the seismic accelerometers will help fill in all these huge gaps in seismic observing to learn more about the ocean and, well, the Earth below the ocean. So why are we doing this? We've all seen these curves, but it always helps to just show them again to reinforce that global warming is accelerating. We're at 1.2 or 3 degrees now, and we've had the warmest 6 years, the last 6 years, and warming has followed before a linear trend, but one might say it's accelerating now, and the rate has increased the last 6 years, and then with La Nina starting now, and the next El Nino, that'll change these somewhat as well. And then this plot again showing CO2 increase or emissions rather, and the fact that we really need to make a precipitous change in our behavior in order to try and limit the temperature increases associated with CO2. And the way this plot is presented, the scaling really shows the huge challenge we have in front of us to try and drop emissions down to zero in such a short time. And then one other aspect is right now there's roughly 1% of the land mass is uninhabitable just because it's simply too hot to live. And then in 2070, this number is expected to rise to 20%. So 20% of the land mass uninhabitable. And then it's just not that 20%, but it's the surrounding areas that are going to be so hot that crops won't grow well, and there's so many other ramifications. Let's see. Okay, so just sort of summarizing some of that, we see that we'll be touching on these different sustainable development goals, SDG 13, climate change, measuring ocean temperature circulation with a direct impact on societies in the short and long term, sea level rise, hazards for coast and islands and cities, and reducing disaster risk. And as I said before, we will be actually working hand in hand with the industry, in the blue economy paradigm to actually improve the telecom infrastructure that we so depend on now as well. So this just shows a more direct projection of what we're trying to do on the UN Decade of Ocean Science challenges and outcomes, and we'll be obviously making measurements that affect the ocean climate nexus, as they call it, and being able to predict the ocean better with measurements. We'll be providing early warning services which affect lives and infrastructure, and then also obviously we're helping to provide yet another kind of orthogonal tool to the ocean observing toolkit. So how are we going to do this? The sort of technical aspects. We're building on existing technology, basically. The top two plots are and the left bottom one are from Japan. Japan is a leader in dedicated early warning systems for earthquakes and tsunamis. And there's several systems installed. SNet is roughly 6,000 kilometers, 6 independent systems to provide early warning as the Pacific plate crunches into Japan. And then the DoNet one SNet has inline sensors, sort of like smart cable, but there's no telecom, commercial telecom in these systems. Obviously, they have a communication system, but and then DoNet is somewhat different in that it has nodes where you can plug and play instruments like the US OOI and Ocean Network Canada, but it requires a remotely operated vehicle. On the lower left is Sanriku, which is a small experimental system put in by the University of Tokyo, and that is actually quite close to what we envision for smart cables. Basically a very simple, just a couple of these 3 basic sensors only, and a simple Ethernet communication system. And so we're suggesting something like that be paired with the commercial telecom system. And then I show the Neptune and OOI arrays here on the lower right. And there is a wet demonstration I'll mention in a minute. So you know, at the small scale level here, looking at one repeater, this is two possible approaches to how to mount the sensors. These are all the repeaters for, I think this was the Brazil to Angola system here, all in the warehouse. So that gives a scale for these repeaters. Seismometer, or the seismic acceleration, can live within the repeater, but pressure and temperature have to be outside the repeater, and temperature sensor has to be away from the heat island to make good measurements. So as the first system, likely the CAM2 system in Portugal is actually fabricated, we will learn how the supplier is actually doing this. So next, I'll show some systems that are underway, and talk about Portugal and Azores. So there are presently roughly 11 systems in the discussion stage, or for Portugal, preparing a request for proposals. There is a wet demonstration. I'll talk about some of these in a little more detail. The bottom line emphasizes that we do have a supplier that has publicly stated that they do see climate change as climate change will be an essential element of their entire business strategy, and two concrete ways they're addressing that are to provide smart capability, and then a optical fiber sensing technique called DAS. I'll mention later. So they have publicly come out and said they will provide this capability. So here are a couple of these systems at various stages. The wet demonstration, top left, off Sicily, will be installed in the coming year, and this is basically similar to Sanriku, showing that one can integrate these sensors into a actual telecom repeater and get good science data from it. Vanuatu to New Caledonia is in the discussion stage, although they do have several million euros on the table committed for that. So we're hopeful that will move forward. And then New Zealand, Chatham Islands, this is a situation where the Chatham Islands have several thousand people only, but the satellite costs are expected to be higher over the next 25 years than a cable system would be. And so the government is looking into connectivity for societal reasons, connectivity reasons, and they are willing to consider adding smart capability and, in fact, more science observing capability to that system. So there was a major workshop last February on that topic, and the New Zealand government is considering that. Antarctica, there was a workshop in late June, sponsored by National Science Foundation. And again, the main goal there is to improve the communication connectivity to the people on Antarctica. Right now, at McMurdo Bay, the US base, they have 100 megabit per second only for the entire base, and so on. And they literally transport hard drives by airplane, pallets of hard drives and so on. And it's very constraining. So they're considering a cable, and specifically a smart cable. They do recognize that adding sensors to the cable will provide just as much, well, a large amount of information about the Southern Ocean and so on. So that is in progress. The National Academy of Science will have a follow-on workshop in March for that. So getting closer to Portugal, this map shows a new cable going from Brazil to Portugal called Elolink. This is just coming into service now. And as part of that, they included a dedicated optical fiber in the branch to Madeira Island to study this new optical fiber sensing technique called distributed acoustic sensing. That technique we see being installed likely in most future submarine cables. It only works out 100 kilometers, but it can sense acoustic vibrations. So anything like that, seismic detection, fishing, trawling, anchors, and ocean waves, and exactly how that all works is still being worked out. This technique is coming from land use, and it's being applied in the marine environment for the first time just in the last year or two, really. And there's a lot going on in that space. So this is an example where research and education networks are getting involved. Géant in Europe will be handling the data for this. There's another system well, they're roughly 6 months away from signing a contract with a supplier for this system connecting Lisbon, Barcelona, Marseille, Sicily, Crete, and Egypt. And there's a possibility of having up to 60 of these smart repeaters there in that system. And we're in the process of trying to raise funds for that. So any suggestions would be much appreciated how to do that. But it's clear this would cover a huge area of tsunami and earthquake risk, and provide, again, ocean bottom measurements of temperature and pressure along these cable routes. So coming to Portugal and this CAM system, again, repeating what I've shown before, this is a little more detail, showing the 50 or so repeaters and some of the past earthquakes and so on. And again, this is motivated by the large amount of seismic activity in the Portugal area, and specifically the 1755 earthquake that destroyed Lisbon and much of the coastlines and so on. I do put down here in the lower left just in smaller print something about cost and comparing cost. We're basically saying the smart capability is roughly 10% of the total cost of a submarine cable, and that's borne out in estimates here. And so if you look over a 25-year life, and the cost, it ends up being 25,000 euros per year per repeater, which is very reasonable for any sensing station delivering real-time data. And that can be compared against what New Zealand has just allocated for tsunami warning for dart buoys, which are basically 500,000 euros per year per buoy. And they've just bought 15 buoys, and 12 are deployed routinely. So that gives an idea of costs. Societal benefit, direct societal benefit, early warning. Again, the 1755 earthquake motivates this. Vitor Silva has done simulations. He works for the global, Global Earthquake Model Organization. And in his simulations, he shows that with even seconds of early warning, just looking at earthquake early warning, some number of lives can be saved, and then less injuries and so on, and that represents on the order of 100 million euros in cost savings if there was one event during this time period. And he has not yet included tsunami, inundation, and infrastructure damage in this estimate. So it's clearly, it pays for itself by reducing risk. Then just to give you a flavor for what may be coming in the future in Portugal, this shows, let's see, top left are existing cables, and some of them many landing in Portugal. And Portugal is becoming the Atlantic digital gateway to Europe. The right-hand plot shows, well, ship traffic, but it shows the EEZ for Portugal, the present, quote, old one, and then the new one, given the new definition of EEZs that is expected. And so Portugal will be controlling or responsible for that huge area, and they are taking steps to make it worthwhile for cable systems to include smart capability. So looking more directly at the Azores, this plot, the blue are all earthquakes over the last 50 years, I think, and then some of the red stars are the larger magnitude, greater than 5 earthquakes. And then there are also some smaller or shorter domestic cables running between these islands. It's maybe hard to see red and yellow cables here. And the idea is to instrument that with this distributed acoustic sensing hardware on the shore ends. And therefore they will be able to measure with much better fidelity earthquakes in the Azores region, and that can help guide exploration and in-depth sampling of the triple junction, and in a broader sense, the entire mid-Atlantic ridge. So it's a great potential, and as these cables are replaced, one should consider cable reuse and so on for more science activities. So what are some of the steps we're taking? There are a number of steps within the UN hierarchy of organizations. Our sponsors, International Telecommunication Union, we're getting resolutions passed and adopted, and the same for IOC, Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, and we Smart Cables have just been endorsed as a project of the decade, and there are meetings going on all the time, me giving presentations and others, and we have now just submitted another white paper for publication to Frontiers of Earth Science. So coming closer to the end here, I see many opportunities that the installation of the cams, the smart cam cable will catalyze, hopefully. So studies of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the eastern half of that, the large scale circulation, and that will require to understand the measurements, observing system simulation experiments. And then there needs to be planning started to do cross calibration and validation between cable observations and other observations. It will definitely contribute to helping to manage the EEZ. And I'm, given my acoustics background, I have suggested that to those 3 basic sensors, a hydrophone be included also, which will help with seismic monitoring and very importantly, the whole new discipline of passive acoustic monitoring, including marine mammals and other sound in the ocean. Ocean sound is now an essential ocean variable as well. And then this could catalyze new technology. I've mentioned, well, as other new cables are installed, they should be smart, and there are options now becoming available to add power branching nodes, so you can plug and play also, and attach observatories, for instance. One technical enabler would be to have autonomous undersea vehicle docking stations where these vehicles can recharge and transfer high data rates, and then go off and do their missions rather than being ship-based and very intensive labor. We need to get the capability of providing power and communication to AUVs on the seafloor, and cables really are probably the only way of doing that. And then also with this capability of plug and play, one can envision long-range acoustic navigation for those AUVs, which at the same time enables tomography, four-dimensional, so space and time dependent temperature essentially within the insonified volume. And lastly, optical fiber sensing is a burgeoning new technology, and people in Portugal are absolutely on board and leading in all that research. So what I'm suggesting is this CAM cable can be the tide that raises all the ships in the area and the world for that matter. Let's see. Okay, and so just to conclude, the smart capability is available commercially by ASN, if not the others, and the first system, the CAM system, is expected in 2024, 2025, and this will be setting precedents for future systems, and there are many opportunities in the Portuguese area, Azores, to take advantage of that will be catalyzed by the CAM2 system. So with that, Brigada, thank you very much, and questions.
Great, thank you very much, Bruce. And again, as before, we welcome questions, especially from the attendees. Please type your question into the Q&A box. Yeah, maybe to get things started again, and you mentioned the possibility of docking, opportunities on those smart cables. How far out would such a technology be? My understanding from talking to you previously is that right now, really you have a certain type of sensors right now that can be can be attached to the smart cables, just because the integrity of the telecommunication part is absolutely essential. But by when do you see that maybe that capability as a monitoring system to be more? Yeah.
So for the Portuguese CAM system, that the possibility of docking stations or branch units is not in the mix. It's too soon. But what I'm suggesting is in some of these other smaller cables or future cables coming into Portugal, in roughly 2 years, there will be commercial branch power nodes that will have been demonstrated and so could be incorporated. Now, the added cost of that is significant, and especially in the operations where remotely operated vehicles are needed. And so, one has to carefully evaluate that. But that capability could exist, and obviously in the Azores region, one, and this has to be debated obviously and discussed, one could set up observatories like off the west of North America, Ocean Network Canada, and so on, to facilitate more detailed studies. Or one could imagine even in future smart cables, one could include a couple of these, to support more detailed measurements. But the smart capability of sensors in every repeater really is the only way to get global coverage at a reasonable cost. And so this adding this extra could be something in the future, but again, it's more costly and will have to be evaluated in that sense.
Laura has her hand raised. Please, Laura. Hi.
Yeah, hi Bruce. That was a great talk. Thanks. Thanks for that. The question was intrigued. You mentioned specifically the hydrophones and potential and the CAM2 cable. Is that actually being considered, and is Alcatel kind of, or considering that?
My
We're really interested
understanding
in that in New Zealand as well, if that comes along.
My understanding is that hydrophones are an option, an optional sensor. And so it'll depend on when they put this out for bid, request for proposals, it'll depend on what the suppliers respond, you know, and if they simply don't respond, then to that option, then it won't happen. But if they do, then you know, if they see the demand, you know, they may choose to include it. As you know, there are these sensitivities about hydrophones, which may or may not be real, but well, there are sensitivities, and you know, even for Portugal, you know, they are now responsible for managing even this larger EEZ area, and illegal fishing is definitely a problem, and hydrophones may help mitigate that. So we'll have to wait and see. But the more people in the science community stand up and say they want hydrophones, the better. Yeah.
Yeah, please, Anna, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is going on the same sense as Laura, but for the biological perspective. So we know that there is a lot of sound communication between not only marine mammals, but each time more fishes and cephalopods and other animals. And one of the constraints when we put hydrophones in the water, it's the amount of energy and the amount of the capability of register all the sounds. So because they have different frequencies and different intensities. So if the option of hydrophones is there will be energy or storage constraints, or it could be really a very broad hydrophone going for several frequencies from very low to very high, and the frequency of acquisition of that.
Yeah, no, I think from a practical point of view, the data bandwidth is almost unlimited. I mean, they're my understanding, they're talking 10 gigabit per second communication links. So even hydrophones won't come close to that. So that should not be a constraint.
Okay, so now we do have one question actually from David Gamboa again. So he asks or states that a relevant perspective of this is also the detection of hazardous submarine events such as landslides. And probably you've heard of this, and I'd like to know your opinion on how feasible it is to spot submarine failures. So this, if you can answer briefly, because we're
right. Yes, this is a relevant topic, and the people at Southampton and National Oceanographic Center are leading, I think, in this effort. And it's very relevant to the International Cable Protection Committee and cables, because recently cables were cut in the Congo River Canyon by turbidity currents, and they happen to have a bunch of other instruments in there to study turbidity currents, and so they're working up that data. And there was examples off Taiwan where 40 cables broke over several years because of submarine landslides. So the expectation is with the seismic and pressure sensors, well, even temperature, there will be signatures of submarine landslides, and so, you know, and then the DAS, which is closer to shore, will absolutely see any perturbation to the cable. So yes, these sensing technique, cable-based sensing will absolutely apply to landslide detection.
Great, thank you. And Felix, I saw you had your hand raised. Maybe we can fold it into the after the last talk, and if you we'll see if we can bundle the remaining questions. So our last but not least speaker is Dr. Laura Wallace. She is a research scientist at the University of Texas Institute for Geophysics, and also, and in fact currently, residing at GNS Science in New Zealand. So thanks, she's joining us at 4 a.m. her local time. Thank you so much for the effort. Laura uses geodetic methods to investigate the formation of the Earth crust at plate boundaries. And she conducts research at various locations, including New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Japan. In 2002, Laura was the first to record slow slip events in New Zealand's Hikurangi margin subduction zone. And investigating slow slip events at the subduction zones has remained central to her research ever since. So with that, the screen is yours, Laura, and thanks again for getting up so early to participate.
No problem. Thanks for having me. And it's now 6 a.m. here. So can you see this now, my presentation?
Yes, we can see it well. Thank you.
You can see it. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the emerging things that have been happening in the field of what we call seafloor geodesy, which is basically targeted at measuring sort of movement and deformation of the seafloor related to tectonic processes, volcanic processes, earthquakes, landslides, and so forth. There's been a lot of really exciting developments in this area in the last several years, and particularly a lot of different things that I think could be feasibly and very interestingly applied in the Azores region and the offshore Portugal region. So first of all, for context, hopefully a lot of you are aware that space-based geodetic techniques, basically techniques using satellite data to measure the deformation and the movement of the land surface over time, have really revolutionized our understanding of plate tectonic processes globally, earthquake processes, and volcanic processes in the last 30 years. We've had kind of an explosion of observations and understanding because of the development of GPS methods, allowing us to track the movement of the Earth's surface at kind of a millimeter level, and then also satellite methods using synthetic aperture radar to actually look at changes in land movement over time. You can see this figure on the left here. This is an INSAR image from the synthetic aperture radar image from Ian Hamley and others from the Kaikoura earthquake in New Zealand in 2016. And you can see very large deformation of the land, many meters of deformation caused by that earthquake at a high level of detail. And then on the right, this is just showing an example of a velocity field, in this case, a global velocity field from GPS stations globally, showing how the Earth is moving and sort of the Earth's surface is moving in response to the movement of the tectonic plates. And these types of measurements have been taken in detail at plate boundary zones and also in volcanic environments to really reveal a lot about what's happening in these regions. But as all of you guys know, 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by the oceans, and these sort of conventional land-based geodetic methods that rely on receiving signals from satellites really don't work beneath the oceans because the signals can't go down to the seafloor. One of the big societal motivations and really one of my interests in seafloor geodetic applications are subduction zones. Subduction zones are basically our planet's biggest generators of earthquake and tsunami, and they're where one tectonic plate dives down beneath another. And the Pacific Ocean basin is really rimmed by the most active subduction zones. And you also have some really interesting subduction zones in the Mediterranean region and also the Caribbean region as well. But because these subduction zones are dipping gently down and the fault surface area is so large, you can actually generate really, really big earthquakes because the size of your earthquake is going to be determined in part by the surface area of the fault that ruptures. And if the fault's rupturing beneath the ocean, this generates sudden seafloor deformation and can generate large tsunami, very destructive and deadly tsunami, as we saw in 2011 in northern Japan and also 2004 in the Indian Ocean. So trying to understand these subduction zones, which for the most part are very difficult to study using only land-based techniques, is a really big motivator for pushing seafloor geodetic methods forward. But there's also a lot of applications being undertaken in volcanic environments and rifting environments, landsliding areas, and so forth. And then I also want to just mention the Azores, since this is a UT Portugal masterclass focused on the Azores. And as Bruce Howe mentioned earlier, we've got basically a triple junction between 3 plates, the African plate, the Eurasian plate, and the North American plate. And a lot of the methods that I'm going to be talking about today can also be applied in this type of environment to investigate both rifting and volcanic processes. And as Bruce mentioned earlier as well, there's a lot of seismicity, particularly historical seismicity offshore Portugal, between Portugal and the Azores, which is of major concern. And a lot of these types of methods can also be used to try and understand the tectonic processes going on behind that. So there's a range of tools that have been developed to address this. A lot, they're kind of, I put these sort of roughly in 3 categories. One category is really focused on the horizontal displacement of the seafloor. The method that's been used the most is called a GPS acoustic method, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next couple of slides, and that'll give you kind of centimeter level accuracy of the movement of the seafloor. There's also different types of acoustic ranging methods, including a direct path ranging method that you can do over, sort of baselines of a few kilometers to give you kind of millimeter level accuracy. I'll also talk about that in a minute. And then a coarser resolution approach is actually doing repeated sort of high resolution bathymetric surveys. You get kind of meter plus, you can sort of capture meter plus deformation signals. So in large earthquakes, volcanic deformation episodes, landslides, and things like that are feasible with that. It's also vertical, a class of techniques that you'd really put into detecting vertical motion of the seafloor. Seafloor pressure sensors, measuring basically the absolute pressure from the overlying water column. We've been using that quite a lot in the last few years at different plate boundaries, and you can get kind of centimeter level accuracy of the vertical deformation of the seafloor, mostly during shorter events, kind of lasting seconds to months. And then there's also been some application of tilt meters as well. And then another category is kind of measuring, actually directly measuring how the Earth's crust is straining. And probably the most successful approach to that, which has actually been used for a very long time, is using International Ocean Discovery Program borehole observatories to measure changes in pore pressure in the crust. And we use that as a proxy for volumetric strain to detect some of these tectonic deformation events. And then more recently, some approaches using fiber optics are also being developed to kind of look at strain on the seafloor, although this is not yet sort of widely implemented. And as I mentioned before, all of these types of methods could be implemented offshore Portugal and the Azores. And Patrick, if you can tell me when I have 5 minutes left, that would be great, because I can't see my clocks. Okay. I don't for hours. Okay, so just to get into the GNSS or the GPS acoustic, people use GPS and GNSS kind of interchangeably. GPS is the old kind of global positioning system. GNSS is the broader sort of global network of satellites that we can also use for precise positioning. But this approach, basically we deploy 3 to 4 precision transponders on the seafloor, and we actually survey in the location of that transponder array using a platform based at the sea surface, typically either a ship or more recently using an autonomous sea surface vehicle called a wave glider. You can see that pictured here on the lower right here. And that the surface-based platform that we're using to range to these acoustic transponders on the seafloor actually has GPS on it. So we know the position of that platform very accurately. And then we continuously range to the precision transponders over a period of days, surveying up to several days will give you centimeter level accuracy of the position of the center of that transponder array. So if you go back and do repeated measurements of these position of these transponder arrays, you can get at the motion of the seafloor related to plate tectonic processes and other processes. Very similar to what we do with onshore GPS, although with onshore GPS, you can see sort of millimeter level movements. With the offshore, it's a little bit lower resolution. Something I want to point out is that wave gliders are being increasingly used in the last few years to do this GPS acoustic type work, and that's really opened up a lot of opportunities because it's much more cost effective than having a big research vessel sitting there for a week making these ranging to the transponder array. These wave gliders, they're remotely operated and they can stay out for months at a time. As is often the case, the Japanese are really leading the way in the application of a lot of these different types of methods. This is just showing here the Japanese Coast Guard has a GPS acoustic array offshore Southwest Japan, adjacent to the Nankai Trough, sitting above the Nankai Trough subduction zone, which is where the Philippine sea plates subducting beneath Japan, and it poses a very large hazard to Japan. This is something they're very concerned about there in terms of earthquake and tsunami hazard. This is showing a publication from a few years ago from a large network, I think of about 14 GPS acoustic arrays measuring the horizontal deformation of the seafloor offshore the Nankai Trough. And this has really revealed the velocities of these sites are really showing that the boundary between the Philippine sea plate and Southwest Japan is actually locked up almost all the way out to the trench. And accumulating strain that will eventually be released in a future earthquake. So this gives us a lot of information about potential future tsunami hazard and earthquake hazard, because this suggests you potentially could have a high likelihood of rupture, a large rupture on the offshore part of the plate boundary, potentially generating a large tsunami. They've also been doing these types of measurements, the Japanese scientists in northern Japan, and they've got a particularly interesting time series of measurements from before, during, and after the magnitude 9 earthquake in 2011 in northern Japan. And you can see before the earthquake, the GPS acoustic sites were moving landward, which is consistent with strong locking on the plate boundary, a lot of stress accumulation prior to the earthquake. And then in the earthquake, they actually measured up to 30 meters of southeastward displacement during the earthquake of their GPS acoustic sites. And that and several other measurements, including repeated bathymetric surveys, revealed astonishingly large movement on that plate boundary offshore near the trench during the magnitude 9 earthquake, an amount that really kind of bowled all of us over, up to about 50 meters of slip on the plate boundary. So that was a really important observation. And then since then, they've continued to make these measurements to look at how the deformation of the seafloor is changing over time as things relax, kind of following the 2011 earthquake. These types of methods are also being applied at a lot of other plate boundaries, including subduction zones in Cascadia, Alaska, and South America, and also at the Hikurangi subduction zone in New Zealand, which is near and dear to my heart, as I spend most of my time studying the Hikurangi subduction zone. But we deployed a couple of years ago 2 GPS acoustic arrays on the offshore subduction zone out near the trench where the 2 plates come together. These red areas on this diagram are showing the areas where the plates, at least from onshore GPS, are locked together. The part beneath land is well constrained, but out here offshore, we really have no idea. The GPS loses resolution for what's happening out there. So we've deployed a couple of GPS arrays out near the trench that we've been surveying to try and figure out, is it actually locked to the trench or is it creeping? And this has a lot of implications for earthquake and tsunami potential. And I'm partly showing this because I actually just got back a couple of days ago from a cruise where we were doing some seafloor instrument recoveries and deployments. And we also just deployed the wave glider again for another period of measurements on our GPS acoustic arrays. Okay, so one of the other approaches to get at horizontal movement is various types of acoustic ranging, and I'll focus here on acoustic direct path ranging. And this is basically a situation where you have some fairly tall monuments, a few meters tall, that are ranging to each other periodically over a long period of time. And they're also taking pressure and temperature measurements to help correct for any variations in sound speed, which is going to affect the ranges that you get. And you can effectively, with this approach, measure change in distance between your acoustic rangers. So if you put one of these across an active fault, you can actually measure how much the fault is moving, whether it's locked or if it's creeping. And you can also measure sort of episodic deformation events on those faults as well. For example, on the lower left here is some results from a really interesting deployment of these rangers near Mount Etna in Italy, from a group at Wegener in Germany. And they actually, you can see this time series on the right here is actually the distance change between 2 of their arrays. And you can see there was an abrupt decrease, or actually, decrease in the distance between those. And that was consistent with basically a slow motion earthquake on a strike slip fault that's flanking Mount Etna in Italy in 2017. We wouldn't have even known that that had happened if they didn't have this type of instrumentation out there. So there's a lot of value in this. And then also another interesting study by the group at IMAR they installed a network of these acoustic rangers across the North Anatolian Fault, just west of Istanbul. And they found that there was no movement between their acoustic ranging arrays across that fault, suggesting that the fault is basically locked up. And, of course, building up stress and strain that will eventually be released in a future earthquake. And so that's got a lot of important seismic hazard implications for Istanbul. So one of the other approaches that we're using to get at some of these movements of the seafloor, particularly for the vertical tectonic deformation, is using seafloor absolute pressure gauges. And this has been used for several years by a number of people, and it's becoming more widely used more recently. But the concept here is that you basically have a sensor on the seafloor that's continuously measuring pressure due to the overlying water column. And if the seafloor goes up during a tectonic deformation event, you have less water above your sensor, so your pressure measured would go down. And if the seafloor goes up, and if the seafloor goes, I think I screwed that up. The seafloor goes down, you've got more water above you. And if the seafloor goes up, you have less water above you. So you have pressure decrease. It's too early in the morning. But this is really interesting results that they've been getting from axial caldera, Bill Chadwick and others at Scripps. And this is in the sort of northeastern Pacific. And this is showing a long time series of seafloor pressure where they're seeing a decrease in seafloor pressure or an increase in seafloor elevation here for about 97 to 2011. And that's showing an inflation, actually on the meter kind of scale inflation of the axial caldera. And then you've got a big drop, a big subsidence of the seafloor pressure site during the 2011 eruption as that magma kind of leaves the system, and then a repeated inflation event, and then another drop. And so forth. So these are some really large vertical deformation signals detected in a volcanic environment, which also could be highly relevant to applying in the Azores region. In terms of getting at smaller scale tectonic deformation signals, in 2014, we undertook a seafloor geodetic experiment offshore New Zealand on the Hikurangi subduction zone, where the Pacific plate is diving beneath the North Island. And we deployed a large array of absolute pressure gauges and also ocean bottom seismometers. And what we were trying to do here is capture vertical deformation of the seafloor during these things called slow slip events, which is basically a slow motion earthquake. It's involving centimeters to tens of centimeters of movement along a fault line, but it's happening over a period of weeks to months instead of in seconds, is what happens in an earthquake. So we deployed these sensors, and we were lucky and had a really large slow slip event during the middle of the deployment. On the left here, you can see our seafloor pressure records before the slow slip event is on the left part of the time series. The slow slip event actually is shaded in green here, and you can see an uplift of the seafloor. So pressure is increasing going down on the y-axis here. So a pressure decrease is uplift. So you can see about 1 to 5 centimeters of uplift of the seafloor. And this is really requiring about 20 centimeters of slip on the plate boundary. And the data is suggesting that that movement, that slip on the plate boundary actually went all the way out to the trench. In terms of applying seafloor pressure, there's some really big issues, technological issues and methodological issues to overcome, particularly around dealing with drift of the pressure sensors. And so that would also be the case for pressure sensors deployed on smart cables and so forth as well. They're going to drift potentially by several centimeters a year or more. And there's been new technology developed by a few different groups to really try and calibrate that pressure sensor drift, and it's called A0A. And I'm just showing two figures here on the right. The figure on the left is showing results from a deployment that we did of A0A in New Zealand a couple of years ago using a system developed by Spar Webb at Columbia University. The far left columns are showing the pressure sensor records before this application of A0A. And you can see drift equivalent to sort of, in some cases, up to 4 to 40 to 50 centimeters per year, which is a large amount of sensor drift and really defeats your ability to measure long-term tectonic deformation. But after the correction with A0A, we managed to beat the drift down to, in some cases, less than a centimeter a year, which is a really big advance. And also similarly, William Wilcock at the University of Washington has been developing a similar system that they tested off Monterey Bay. They were able to get the drift down on that to less than half a centimeter. So this is something I think that's also important for oceanographic studies, because if you want to be looking at longer term oceanographic changes. Did you say 5 minutes?
Yep.
Yeah, great, thank you. If you want to be looking at longer term oceanographic changes, really need to address this drift issue. And then also for the seafloor geodesy, we need to be working with oceanographers to really try and develop better techniques to reduce some of the oceanographic signals in these seafloor pressure records. As you can see, all these fluctuations that you see here in both of these time series are related to oceanography. And in many cases, that's much larger than the tectonic signals that we're trying to get at here. So we really need to be coming together to overcome this. Okay, the last technique that I want to talk about is pressure sensing in IODP boreholes. And how this works, hopefully most of you have heard about the International Ocean Discovery Program. It basically supports scientific drilling platforms to go around and do scientific ocean drilling. And in some of these drill holes, observatories have been installed, particularly in plate boundary environments. And one of the things that we tend to measure in these boreholes are downhole pressure changes. So changes in the formation pressure down the hole. And we basically use this with hydraulic lines running down the casing, and those hydraulic lines are then connected to pressure sensors at the wellhead. This is just showing an example from the Nankai Trough in Japan. This is actually really exciting outcome of these borehole observatories. And these are two sites out near the Nankai Trough, and we detected, they've detected, several of these events, transient deformation events, which are slow slip events on the offshore Nankai Trough out near the trench, which no one knew existed before, and is really important in terms of monitoring that subduction zone and the hazard it poses. We've installed a couple of borehole observatories on the plate boundary offshore New Zealand to monitor the very large slow slip events that we see here. And one of the measurements we're taking, in addition to several other types of measurements, are pore pressure as a proxy for volumetric strain. This is just a picture of the wellhead here. We just visited the observatory with ROPOS, the ROV, a few months ago. This is showing some of the downhole pressure changes from these observatories. The black time series are the downhole pressure changes in the observatories. The red time series are east displacement or east positions from the GPS site just on shore here. So you can see this big slow slip event, a large eastward displacement in 2019. We see large increases in pore pressure, meaning contraction, at our observatory sites during the slow slip event. You can see this bottom black time series is from the site closest to the GPS site. It tracks really, really well with the slow slip event timing and evolution. But from the site out near the trench, that onset of the deformation is delayed by a couple of weeks, and also seems to persist and go into extension after the slow slip event is seen on the onshore GPS, suggesting that the event actually propagated to the trench and may have persisted for a few weeks longer and may have actually gone all the way to the trench. So I guess one of the sort of reasons for showing the New Zealand examples is really because we're dealing with a high noise ocean environment, we're looking at trying to measure very small signals, millimeter, centimeter level signals. What we've been really trying to target in New Zealand is doing multi-proxy measurements, getting as many different types of seafloor geodetic instruments out there as we can, and also doing co-located seismological deployments to really reveal some of these, this spectrum of deformation processes that are happening at our plate boundaries. And I didn't mention in the previous slide, but these cork observatories, these IODP observatories, which I will mention, are actually giving us the highest resolution view of what's happening in terms of tectonic deformation out there. You can see the signal to noise ratio on these black time series is actually much higher than that, even on the onshore GPS time series. So I think this is a really very valuable tool. Okay, so I just want to wrap up, and this links back a bit to Bruce's talk, so where are we headed offshore New Zealand? As Bruce mentioned, the New Zealand government is investigating feasibility of running a fiber optic cable from the east coast of New Zealand to the Chatham Islands, which is about 800 kilometers to the southeast. And this is really targeted at improving their connectivity. And it's felt that a cable would be more cost effective than satellite communications. So we held a workshop because the New Zealand government is interested in considering potential scientific and geohazards monitoring benefits. So we had a workshop that Bruce mentioned in February. And actually we had a couple of participants from Portugal at that workshop. We really appreciated that. And to discuss, potential for adding science to this cable and some really interesting possible routes, in particular going from landing stations in the North Island that would cross the Hikurangi subduction zone and allow us to actually do more continuous monitoring using a lot of the different types of seafloor geodetic approaches that I've been talking about here, and also a sustained presence in terms of seismology and pressure sensing for tsunami early warning, as well as a range of oceanographic and biological questions that could be addressed. So the workshop participants agreed that really to address a lot of the diverse science goals in the region, that an ideal scenario would be a sort of hybrid approach with, of course, definitely smart sensor packages at repeaters, as Bruce discussed in his talk, also additional dark fiber for distributed acoustic sensing, and to enable more flexibility in the different types of instrument packages that could be installed in sort of targeted areas, maybe a couple of powered branching units for some of these external sensor packages. And I would love to have a branching unit near our IODP observatories up here on this route going from Gisborne. And if we could get that Cork observatory data in real time, that would be fantastic. So I think there's some real clear synergies with the Portuguese CAM2 cable effort. And we're really watching the effort in Portugal with that with a lot of interest. It's a really exciting development that you guys are really embarking on, and I think that that will really inform quite a lot potential design for a possible system in New Zealand. So and I will just leave it at that. There's a lot of new methods, particularly focusing a lot on GPS acoustic and acoustic ranging for horizontal deformation, seafloor pressure sensors for vertical displacement, and the downhole pressure sensing in boreholes. But I really want to hammer home to kind of emphasize, following on from Bruce's talk, that increasing use of cabled infrastructure is really going to help greatly to expand coverage beneath the oceans and enable long-term time series of offshore tectonic and volcanic deformation processes and real-time monitoring. So thank you.
Great, that was a great talk and tour de force with so many emerging technologies on the horizon. Again, I open it up for questions, and as always, I'm hoping attendees may have a question, but also encourage the audience, the panel at this point to engage. Maybe one quick question. Well, actually, Felix, yeah, I see your, please, Felix, go ahead.
Right, great talk, very inspiring. Thanks a lot. So this is all very new to me, but you made the point that how closely that is connected to what Bruce was presenting earlier, and what I understood is that actually your studies get very powerful if you actually link different data together. Like you have you have seismic activity, and then on top you have deformation, and so. Looking at the sensor set of Bruce, that was mainly looking into the seismic activity and then maybe the vertical lift, if I understand that right, with the absolute pressure sensors. So what you miss is the geodetic information. So is there a possibility without like just use power for the cable and then move from there with your instrumentation you already have in place, going in this repeater idea? Is there a sensor that you could add there that actually would provide that information?
So the pressure sensors in the smart packages would be a big boon for seafloor geodesy in terms of providing information about vertical deformation. So we would be able to do with the smart sensors as they're designed seafloor geodesy with those, to a degree. And, you know, having the seismometers there as well add a lot of value to the interpretation of seafloor geodetic data. But then there's also the distributed acoustic sensing and potential. You know, I don't think people have developed methods yet that will help us get at slow slip events or long-term deformation, but I think there's potential there for using the actual cable itself for getting at that with other types of methods, sort of similar in some ways to distributed acoustic sensing. And Bruce is actually probably more familiar with some of those. But then the other, I think part of the reason that in New Zealand for our discussions on the cable, we were really advocating adding some, you know, powered branching units there to enable additional sensor packages, is things like, you know, the acoustic ranging. We could, you know, plug in some of these rangers and power them and actually get the data in real time. That would be a really exciting opportunity. And then I don't know, I mean, with a lot of the acoustic ranging, you need either a direct path. So it would probably be hard to imagine using just a sort of simple smart sensor package to do that acoustically, although you could potentially do that with taking advantage of the cable and the fiber optic sort of approaches that are being developed. So yeah, but I think if we can add powered branching units to some of these things, that can really open up a lot of possibilities. And I see Bruce has his hands up. He's probably got a lot of wisdom here.
Well, just one comment. This is another motivation to get a hydrophone in there, because in theory, then that becomes a seafloor geodesy asset, if you will. And you can imagine, like CAM2, you'd run a wave glider, you know, along the cable route continuously and sequentially measure that hydrophone location. Precise timing is absolutely included in the cable system. So that's another motivation for getting the hydrophone in there. One would have to, you know, investigate the absolute stability of the repeater on the seafloor, but I think it's reasonably well established that they do not move around at least, you know, millimeters and centimeters normally, let's say.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that I hadn't thought of, taking advantage of that if we're able to incorporate hydrophones in there. And particularly if you're able to get, with your vision of having smart repeaters all over the world, hopefully some of those cables aren't moving, you know, and we could actually be using at least a subset of them to be thinking about that sort of approach. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, no, this is really very exciting, and I think the session really has shown sort of the breadth of really interesting topics related to both the ocean, the fluid portion, the living portion of the abyssal ocean, of the seafloor and below, and then of course some of these measurement systems in support for hazard detection, maybe early warning, which I think is a very strong motivator, and maybe that's what New Zealand and Portugal have in common. And it's great to see sort of this knowledge exchange happening. We're over time or out of time, therefore I'd like to thank all the speakers again very much for presenting these excellent talks. I will check with the organizers, hoping make sure that these will be made available as recordings. I hope everyone is okay with those, but please let me know if not, or yeah, with that, I thanks everyone, and have a good morning, good night, wherever you are. I'm actually in Switzerland right now. So we have a really almost like a global masterclass that we've organized here. So yeah, thanks everyone again, and bye-bye.